Linux users identify as user of their operating system far more often than users of Windows or Mac OS X. So says a new article by esteemed article guy me. I'm just going to read that for you here. I've got charts, lots and lots and lots and lots of charts. I've got numbers behind this one, brought to you in part by Linode. Go to linode.com/Lunduk and you can get a lot of money. Well, like $20. You get a $20 credit, but that goes a long way when you're setting up a cloud server of some kind. Set up a Nextcloud box, set up a Telnet BBS, whatever you set up. Do it over at linode.com. And Pogo Linux, who make truly spectacular workstations and servers and big beefy machines. If you want to see how beefy of a machine you can configure, go to pogolinux.com. Literally, some of their machines I have never seen another company offer the likes of. Just go there, go to their servers tab, click on the servers, and then configure it. Like, challenge yourself. See how much storage you can fit into some of their like 4U racks and whatnot. It is absolutely monstrous over at pogolinux.com. All right, I'm just going to read this article here. If you want to read it for yourself, it's over on my Patreon page, patreon.com/Brian Lunduk. Is that right? Am I talking about it right? Yeah, that's the right URL. Or you can go to lunduk.com and there's links all over the place. But I digress. We've all heard anecdotes. I'm going to start reading now. We've all heard anecdotes or stereotypes of die-hard Mac users or Linux zealots. Stories of people who strongly identify with the computers they use, aka, I'm a Mac user. I mean, it's such a stereotype. There have been whole ranges of commercials like the I'm a Mac, I'm a PC commercials and the spin-off I'm Linux commercials. And people talk about, oh, that's a bunch of Arch users over there. You know it because they walk around saying they use Arch all the time. I mean, and then Mac users talk about Macs all the time, or at least they used to. And I mean, this was a stereotype for a reason, right? I'm going to continue. But how often do people really identify with the operating system they use the most on their computer? I recently conducted a survey as part of a study on how operating systems impact our happiness. Responses were submitted from 2,259 computer users using a broad range of operating systems. Really, I was surprised at how broad of a sample set we got with this. This started out as just from my audience here, and then I sent it around to a couple of community leaders here and there, and people that I knew were more die-hard Windowsy and Mac people and whatnot. I even sent it over to a few Amiga folks for them to kind of disseminate around, trying to get as broad of a sample set as we can, just because I wanted as many data points as possible. And primarily from pro-user communities, i.e. not a random cross-section of the populace. So this was clearly, even though it wasn't just, listeners and fans of my show, that's where it started, and then it went to other communities, but also they were mostly pro-user communities. And what I mean by pro-user is either enthusiasts or developers or people who are working in a computer related industry and the like. So people who were more likely to spend time thinking about computers, right? Not just, Grandpa Ed and Aunt Edna, right? It wasn't just them who don't know what a right click is, it was people who were more pro users. So think about that when we're looking at the data. One of the questions I asked was, do you personally identify with your most used operating system? For example, I am a Mac user. This was just one question I asked, and the responses I got were fascinating. Of people that use Mac OS X as their primary, aka their most used operating system, 49.2% said they identified as a Mac OS user, and 50.8% said they did not identify with the operating system. I've got a nice little chart here. So basically 50-50. In other words, roughly half of Mac OS X users identified with the operating system at least a little. On the flip side, 74.1% of Microsoft Windows users did not identify with Windows. I mean, that is a stark difference. In fact, only 5.5% 85% of people who use Windows as their primary system felt they identified with it strongly. The difference between Mac and Windows users is perhaps not terribly surprising considering the reputation Windows has as being more utilitarian. And on the flip side, there exists the oft-used idea of cult of Macintosh. So on the one hand, you've got Mac users who have a stereotype of being kind of zealoty, of being willing to suspend their disbelief, of existing within the reality distortion field of Stephen R. Jarbs, these sorts of things. Whereas Windows users tend to be using Windows because they got it on their compact Presario or whatever, their Packard Bell, if you will. How then do Linux users view themselves? Linux, while also having a very utilitarian and pro-user reputation, likewise has a strong vocal community. The numbers are striking. These are absolutely insane. 90.5% of Linux users surveyed stated that they identified with their most used operating system, with 5.4% of them saying that they strongly identified with Linux. 9 out of 10 people using Linux identify as such. In other words, if you happen to use Linux as your primary system, odds are that you identify as such. I mean, this is so intense that 55.4% of people strongly say that use Linux strongly say I am a Linux user, right? That's what they said. Strongly. That is a higher number than the total amount of people who strongly or a little bit identify as a user of a Mac or as Windows in terms of percentage of the user populace. That is a huge number. In fact, the percentage-wise, people who use Linux so overwhelmingly identify as users of Linux, 90.5%, that is more than the total positive people that identify as Mac and people that identify as Windows combined. 25.9% of people say, yeah, I'm a Mac I'm a Windows user. And then was it 49.2% say they identify as a Mac user. You combine those two percentages together, it still doesn't add up to the percentages that you get on the Linux side of things. I mean, those are intense numbers. Those are really, really intense. I said that as awkwardly as humanly possible, but the numbers are intense. You can go look at the charts for yourself. I included the largest of the mobile platforms, Android and iOS as well. Why not, right? Let's look at that. Curiously, at least to me, was the fact that iOS users were more likely to identify with their operating system than Mac users. Let that sink in for a second. 54% of people surveyed who identify as using, who state that they use iOS as their primary platform. Now, this to be clear about this, we're talking about people who say iOS is the operating system I use the most for computing, right? And it's not as large of a user block as say, Linux or Windows or even Mac, but it is a significant user block. Assumedly people that use, iPad Pros and the like. Of them, 54% identify as an iOS user, whereas less than 50%, 49.2% identify as a Mac user. Now think about that. I mean, just 10 years ago, I don't have raw numbers to back this up because I didn't do such a survey 10 years ago, but I would have assumed that the percentage of people that said, I am a Mac user, of people that actually use Macs would be higher. Certainly in throughout the 90s and in the early 2000s, the fan base of the Macintosh side of thing was much more fervent. I would have assumed that percentage would have been higher. And to now be here in 2019 and have people who are using iOS be more ardent about it, more self-identifying about it than Mac users. So that's kind of a big thing. The results for Android users were surprisingly similar to iOS users. Android users, again, people that identify as saying, I use Android more than other systems. It's my primary computing platform. Of them, the numbers look similar. I mean, look at the pie charts. They're almost identical. The results for Android users were surprisingly similar to iOS users. Android users more often identified with their mobile platform, 55.7%, than iOS users with theirs, 54%. It's a difference of 1.7%, right? Based on the sample size, however, it seems entirely possible that the margin of error here would put the two platforms as nearly identical in these terms. I don't have, exact stats on what I consider the margin of error here is, because it's the first time that I've done such a survey, so I don't have anything to compare against. But it would seem reasonable to say that, okay, we've got a couple thousand people pulling this data from. Certainly, there's going to be some sort of a margin of error there. So really strikingly similar. I mean, just look at how similar iOS and Android charts are. Only very minor differences. That's iOS, that's Android. iOS, Android. I mean, it's really similar. The idea of identifying with your operating system was not the primary focus of this study, simply a side question used for additional background and variables when looking at the primary theme of operating system impact on happiness. As I was analyzing the numbers, these particular results struck me, and I felt compelled to share them independently of the other results. Which, by the way, I'm still working on pulling all those results together, and I'm finding it absolutely fascinating. More later this week about that. It might be worth doing further research on this topic of, what people identify as in terms of their operating system down the line, with more pointed questions to help draw further conclusions and see what other correlations can be found. For the moment, based on the data at hand, I think it's safe to say Linux users, at least among the pro user segment of the population, tend to identify with their platform in a profoundly more common way than either Mac or Windows users, to the point where happens to use Linux and identifies as a Linux user is almost synonymous. I found this fascinating. I wasn't really expecting this. The poll I put together, it's not really a poll, it's kind of more of a survey, the big page of questions. I wanted to have this in there because I wanted to be able to say, okay, does your operating system make you happy? And then do you identify as a user of the operating system? In part because I thought that would be an interesting thing to know. Does an operating system make someone unhappy, but yet they still identify as a user of such? These are just interesting data points, right? I didn't expect to be truly fascinated by the results I had of this particular question all by itself. Now, clearly, we could have spent more time drilling down and saying what defines identifying as a user of a platform. I left it fairly vague, saying I am a Mac user or I am a Linux user, right? And I left that somewhat vague and somewhat open to the interpretation of the end user taking the survey. But I think my guess is most people probably had that same thought in mind of identifying it with that operating system in some way, a little or a lot, saying I am a Linux user. And the fact that Linux users were ranked so highly, I expected it to be high. I expected it to be over 50%. I did not expect it to be over 90%. I expected the Mac the Mac side of things to be a little bit higher than it was. I thought it may be more like 60%, 70%. I didn't expect it to be a little bit less than 50%. That surprised me. I was also surprised at how low the Windows results were. I wasn't thinking it was going to be just around a quarter, right? I thought we'd be looking at, 30, 40%, 50, maybe even close to 50%, right? Because this is, again, among a more pro audience. Fascinating. 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10. Look at this chart. Do you identify as a Linux user? Yes, strongly. Yes, a little. No. 9.5% gets the no. That's crazy. Anyway, thank you guys for indulging me with this. If you'd like to go read the article and check out the numbers, there you can, and grab the charts, do whatever you want with it. Share it around. It's freely readable for everyone. It's on Patreon, but you don't have to pay for it. You can just go read it. There's going to be links underneath in the description of the video if you're on lbry or YouTube, or you can just go to lunduke.com or patreon.com/Brian Lunduke if you want to read it. And if you subscribe to me over on Patreon, you get little email notifications whenever new articles come out. So like if you want to be notified when the how do operating systems impact your happiness study kind of comes out, you can just get an email notification if you pitch in a few bucks via Patreon. Don't have to, but it helps keep the lights on. Look at this. Well, I'm going to turn the light off. It got darker in here. Oh my gosh. It's getting darker. Okay, I'm going to turn the lights back on. I don't like it when it's all dark in here. It's scary. So don't make it scary for Lunduke. Pitch in a couple of bucks. Or head on over and let our sponsors know that you love the show over at linode.com/Lunduke for that $20 credit, or straight over to pogolinux.com. Go over to lunduke.com and click the links. Really show them in their analytics or something. I know a lot of you can type it in when I'm speaking it out, but go click on the thingies anyway. Anyway, if you also head over to lunduke.com, you get all the other links of different ways you can get the show and the articles and all that sort of thing, and blah 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 blah, and then you blah blah blah, and then you just go blah blah blah. See you guys later.